Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Royal Society. My name is David Reed. I'm a recent past Vice President of the Royal Society and its erstwhile Biological Secretary, and I've been given the great privilege this evening of introducing tonight's speaker. Just before I do that, I have to ask you that if you have brought your mobile phones into the room, could you please make sure that they're switched off? This is particularly important because tonight's lecture is being webcast live from the Royal Society's website, and so obviously any interference of that kind would be pretty serious. As I say, it's a great privilege for me to be able to introduce tonight's speaker. Those of you who, like me, have a natural, perhaps almost instinctive interest in the origin of our species and its spread out of Africa will be aware of the crucial contributions to our understanding of early evolution of humans that have been made by Richard Leakey. Accompanying his family on expeditions to the Kenyan bush from the age of 4, Richard quickly developed both an advanced capability as a field paleoanthropologist and at the same time a love of the natural environment of his native land, a love that has never left him. Between 1968 and 1989, in a more formal context, he led many expeditions to the shores of Lake Turkana on behalf of the National Museums of Kenya. This is an organization which eventually he transformed as its director into a world-class center for the study of human origins. Many vital and important discoveries were made over these years. Amongst them, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with them, but amongst the ones that I would pick out were the discovery of Stone Age tools dated at something like 1.9 million years, numerous Australopithecine bones, as well as remains of early members of the genus Homo, including skulls of Homo erectus and Homo habilis. Amongst the discoveries, perhaps the one for which Richard is most famous is that of an almost complete 1.6 million year old skeleton of a youth, popularly recognized by the press as Turkana Boy. In 1989, Richard was appointed head of the Kenya Wildlife Service, and this organization also he transformed by common consent and at great personal cost. Amongst those costs, you may be familiar with the fact that while flying an aeroplane in the service of the Kenya Wildlife Service, the plane crashed under somewhat suspicious circumstances, and Richard lost both of his legs below the knee. He showed, again, huge resilience in tackling the corruption with which he was presented in this government department, and again converted it from a deeply corrupt, perhaps the most corrupt department of the Kenyan government into a streamlined and efficient organization. In the course of this work, he fought courageously and indomitably against poachers of elephant and rhino and pretty much cured those problems at that time. In this period, he publicly demonstrated a deep concern for conservation of Kenya's increasingly pressurized natural resources. One of his most outstanding and outspoken books, published in 2001, Wildlife Wars: My Fight to Save Africa's Natural Treasures, is a book which provides graphic illustration of his broadening and deepening concern for the natural environment. Richard left the Wildlife Service in 1994 to become Secretary General of the Kenyan opposition party Safina, and in 1997 he was elected to the Kenyan Parliament as an opposition MP representing that party. His career as a politician ended, I think, by his choice in 1999 when President Moi appointed him head of Kenya's civil service, with a brief again to revitalize and cleanse the infrastructure of the Kenyan government. Dr. Leakey today holds the chair of anthropology at Stony Brook University in New York and is chairman of Wildlife Direct. We were proud to elect him as a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2007. Most recently, he has established himself as a supporter of many grassroots wildlife conservation projects and has increasingly campaigned to increase awareness of the threats posed to the planet, and particularly to its non-human occupants, by the activities of man. He will address us this evening on this particular subject. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to ask Richard Leakey to present his lecture entitled Climate Change and Extinction. Richard.
Thanks, David.
Thank
you. Thank you very much. Mostly true, but not entirely. It's a pleasure to be here, and a great personal pleasure to present a talk at this august venue. The last time I was in this room was when I was inducted as a fellow, which was an unexpected and quite memorable occasion for me, and I'm very grateful to the Royal Society and the fellowship for having afforded me the honor of being amongst you. As somebody said that day, I think it was a name I can't mention, said, "Are you sure they got the right one?" I would like to start out saying that I'm going to focus largely on the conservation issue, but will delve into a little bit of the experiences that the search for paleoanthropology gave me, and the insight that it gave me on some occasions. But perhaps before I start and go further, I would like to acknowledge in the room, the presence in the room of my wife, Dr. Maeve Leakey, who probably has far more major discoveries of ancient humans, including new species, than I have. But like in the case of my father, traditionally the press has been gender insensitive, and they throw the credit at me while it is in fact she who has done most of this work. So I would like to acknowledge that and say that. Thank you. When I was asked to create the Kenya Wildlife Service as its first, well, I joined the government as a departmental head, and one of the conditions we put on it was that there should be a less government connection, and we formed what I think in this country used to call a quango. The board was appointed by the minister, but the board theoretically had independence of operation. And I was charged with creating this new organization, raising funds for it, and eliminating elephant poaching in particular in the shortest possible time. I had previously thought about animals largely in terms of their bony parts, because we had collected a large number of skeletons of mammals and birds and amphibia and reptiles. In the museum, I had spent a lot of my own time collecting skeletons back in the early 60s, and I found myself always looking at an animal in terms of what I knew about its skeleton and whether that skeleton would lend insight into some of the unidentified fossils that we had picked up at Lake Turkana. And so my relationship with wildlife, while passionate and certainly quite intense, was a little bit morbid in that I was more familiar with them dead than I was with them alive, and tended to think in those terms. However, one can change quite quickly, and I was struck initially by the fact that people who were leading conservation in Africa were a fairly well-established group, or could I say club. They all knew each other, and I was completely the new boy on the block. And I wasn't even sure why everyone was doing what they were doing, because some of the things didn't make that much sense, and some of the challenges we seemed to have didn't appear that great. And obviously fundraising was important, and people were struggling to raise little sums of money to do this and do that. And I fell back on what I had learned some years before, and that is if you ask donors for a little bit of money, you can talk and talk and talk and plead and plead and plead. But if you ask them for an outrageous sum, you're immediately taken seriously, and you get to talk to the people who make decisions about outrageous sums. And when somebody asked me how much money I needed to put this wildlife situation on its feet, I sort of thought for a moment and said $300 million. And they said, but that's a tremendous amount of money. I said, yes, but I'll spread it over 10 years, but I'll take 150 for the first 5 years. Within less than 6 months, we were able to raise the money, and we in fact raised more than that, and it was one of the easiest fundraising things I've ever done. And I'm quite sure it was less my powers of persuasion and more the fact that we were asking for far more than middle-rank people could deal with, and therefore I got straight up to the places where these decisions were made. And that's perhaps a tip for some people in this business. But the other thing that struck me was I asked a number of people, particularly people from southern Africa, what was the purpose of conservation, and particularly what was the purpose of a national park? Because this is where our focus had to be in terms of the management plan that we were putting in place. And I remember being told almost ad nauseum by experts from southern Africa, particularly South Africa, but also Botswana, that the real objective of a national park was to preserve the pristine nature of a limited area where there was ecological balance and where all things were to be kept like that, frozen in time. And having looked at fossils and been particularly struck by the frequency of extinction occasioned by ecological change, which in turn was obviously brought about by climate change, whatever caused climate change varies in terms of the epoch you're talking about. But I said to them, when do you set the clock as somewhere having been pristine? Does it start when the minister signed the Gazette notice? And are you preserving it as a wasteland because people were farming it and mining it? Or are you thinking of something else? And if we get a national park that has been abused by people as farmers or miners, where do we take the clock back to in terms of the sort of ecological situation that you're looking for? And I concluded that the concept of something being pristine was a pretty awkward one to work for, and that the best we could do would be to try and sustain an area as best we could in terms of how it was at the moment, and to avoid the inevitability of increasing pressure on that area because of human activity. And if you go back in time and go back to the first national parks, those that were established in the United States, on the northwest side of the United States, Yosemite and Yellowstone, it was indeed for the sense that these areas had to be preserved because ranchers and loggers and farmers were just destroying the habitat so fast that future generations would have no idea of the extraordinary natural beauty that occurred in those parts of the world that still existed. And so the national park concept was born in the United States and rapidly followed up in other places. Since then, I would think 7,000 or 8,000 national parks or similarly defined areas have been set apart under one legislation or another, and the concept is about the same. Let's keep people out and let's stop illegal activities, and at least we are saving a big chunk of biodiversity in our best efforts. And if you talk to a lot of people, they do say that even though the human affairs picture is pretty messy, and that there's starvation and there's poverty and there's this and there's disease in domestic stock and disease in people, at least in nature, we've got these sanctuaries where things are as close as you could want to get to how it always was and always should be. And that's when I turned back in my thinking to the prehistoric record, where, as I said, and I'm sure all of you know, and it doesn't need stressing, extinction has been so frequent and so common, and the vast majority of species, if however you want to define them, that have existed, exist no more. And the currently recognized 1.5 million species that have been at least named. There's probably a good deal more. This is a relatively poor reflection of what this planet has had in terms of different forms of life stretching back hundreds and millions of years, and even stretching back just a few tens of thousands of years. Extinction has been dramatic, it's been common, and it is only in the last 2 or 3 decades that paleontologists have begun to look for the reason behind extinction and look for, through that, possible explanation of why certain changes took place in lineages that they're following. Why did an early ape become bipedal? What was the pressure to do something so stupid? As you know, walking around on 2 legs isn't very easy. And it must have been an enormous advantage at some time for that particular shift to have taken place. And it took place in excess of 5 billion years from today. And we still don't understand why bipedalism, and we don't necessarily understand the link between the attainment of bipedalism in an ape, or perhaps in several apes. But what I think one can say is that although later there were other things that became important, including the expansion of the brain, encephalization, and the use of hands to make tools, had we still had our hands concerned with supporting ourselves, either on the ground or from the trees, we would not have been able to use a big brain to manipulate the environment, which we can now do because of the dexterity we have in our hands. And so it really is an interesting question as what led to the earliest hominins in the first place. And then through time, there are other major episodes that you can look at and say, well, it seems to be there was an ecological change, there was an increase in temperatures or decrease in temperatures, more water, less water, greater rainfall, less rainfall. So there's a whole range of discussions. And it's against that backdrop that I and a number of others took an interest in what was happening today, and whether or not these national parks could possibly be sustained, given that most of them now are simply islands. And I say simply islands because these national parks have been, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, surrounded by other forms of human activity, whether it's ranching or agriculture or city development or industrial estates. And we have many, many thousands of protected areas that are no longer places from which at least the terrestrial and short traveling distance species can get out or others get in. And so this is a conundrum that we seem to find ourselves in, irrespective of the fact that the earliest intentions were very good, and that was to preserve them. When you look at some specific national parks, you can already see that there is a real danger that the species list, the biodiversity, is threatened. Much of the threat in the last 50 years, certainly in the tropics and in the developing countries, has been hunger for land, and it's been the lack of authority in maintaining a strict and clear boundary. But today we are seeing that authority lessening, and in many parts of Africa in particular, but also in Southeast Asia and other parts of the developing world, corruption has led to a slippery slope, and you can buy your way into a national park to collect sandalwood, you can buy your way into a national park to burn charcoal, you can buy your way into a national park to poach crocodiles, you can buy your way into a national park to do all sorts of things, including grazing of cattle and domestic stock. And you can buy your way into people turning a blind eye to simply open poaching using rifles, high-powered rifles, to kill species that have huge commercial value, such as the rhinoceros for its horn and the elephant for its ivory. Those are issues that I think we can still deal with. I think we can get back to a more disciplined conservation approach. We can give more thought to that. But what has also become clear is as these areas have become more restricted, there has become an increasing urgency to manage and an increasing urgency to actually apply husbandry, to understand what needs to be done to sustain the balance is a bad term, but to sustain the systems that are there that will have its ups and downs, but nonetheless are moving forward in a reasonably or apparently rational way. And this is where it becomes very difficult because, as many of you will know, the minute you get scientific inquiry into ecosystems and management policies, you run up against all sorts of opposition and all sorts of legitimate and often informed scientific opinion as to what one should do. And there is today a very clear division between those who belong to the school of thought that nature must take its course and we must watch what happens with interest but hands off, and those who say nature cannot take its course because we have surrounded it and we owe it to nature, whatever that means, to play our hand in determining what the predator-prey relationship is, whether certain plants that haven't had have been too overutilized need to be replanted, whether we need to protect trees from animals that are knocking them over like the elephant, and things of this kind. And so there is still a misunderstanding as to how you look after these small areas, assuming that that is the only threat, and that is that people are pressing in on them, and that in time certain species are multiplying too rapidly. And of course, the elephant is a very good example, where if you essentially restrict an elephant from leaving where the population normally resides for the whole year, or part of the year, they quickly seem to destroy the habitat. And whilst the elephant is probably one of the more adaptable species, and one of the national parks in Kenya, Amboseli, is a case in point, the question then is, when an elephant knocks over all the trees, because it wants the bark and the seeds, and all the trees and bushes gone, and it's replaced by short grass and unedible plants, what has that done to countless other species of birds and insects and reptiles and amphibia, as well as mammals, that previously were common to that area and now exist no more? Are we turning rich biodiversity into species-specific national parks? And this is a debate that continues, and it's a debate that's very hard to guide, given that a lot of the solutions that need to be applied are unpopular with tourists and cost a lot of money. And certainly if you start fencing off areas of a national park to give the vegetation an opportunity to come back, people come in and complain that they didn't come to see fences. If you put radio collars around animals to see where they move to, tourists come in and say, you know, these look like domestic animals, and we didn't come to take pictures of a rhinoceros with a bright orange tag in its ear, or a zebra with a collar around its neck. And tourism is obviously critical to raise the money that's enabled us to do these things in the first place. So it all gets frightfully complicated and rather depressing at times. However, I think a much more critical concern, and one which I would address now, is that let us assume we can do all those things. Let us assume that we can really play the hand correctly. We can retain species because we eliminate excesses and we introduce where they're too few, and we can sort of come up with our concept of what the right balance is. And I say balance because I think if there really were balance in nature, there would have been no evolution, and we certainly wouldn't have been around. So I think it's the imbalance that's important, and the dynamics of the imbalance that has been critical. But let us assume that we can satisfy popular demand and get close to keeping it as it was when we made it a park, and get close to being able to say, look, we can keep the place with a percentage of predators and a percentage of prey, and we can probably sustain that for the next 30 or 50 years, which is, after all, a reasonable amount of time for the paying public to concern itself with. But then, of course, you have the problem of pressure outside the national parks, and that is a difficult issue. When you look at a number of parts of the world that are in the tropics and the desperate crisis for water, and you realize that most of the biodiversity, at least the mammalian and bird life, needs some access to fresh water, and the people outside the park are not in any sense balanced. They're multiplying rapidly in the poorer areas, and they're looking for water, and they're now taking water off rivers. And there are many instances around the world in the tropics, and particularly in the dry areas, where rivers that used to run year-round now run perhaps for half the year, and the other half, the water's being taken off long before it gets into the protected area for wildlife. There's still residual pools, but the water doesn't come out on the other side of the park, and we are putting in jeopardy the survival of the park simply on that one resource, if not to mention others, which I will. So the fight for water and the increased human population raises some very, very tough issues for politicians in any country, but particularly for politicians looking after relatively poor countries, where competition for survival using public resources is acute, and politicians will respond to challenges that the national parks or the conservation body or the wildlife service values animals more than people. Look, that they're trying to stop us taking the water off so that their animals will survive, and we're dying of starvation because we can't irrigate our crops. And you get into a very angry and awkward situation. The other thing that's happening is water decreases and human pressure increases. A lot of these animals, particularly elephants, but also predators, find that they're often better pickings outside the park area because people have planted crops, people have created water troughs, and these animals are not as stupid as we like to think. And they go out at night, and there's some very good work that has been done by a number of people, but particularly I'll mention Ian Douglas Hamilton, who works in Kenya, where he's collared elephants, and he's, via satellite, he's able to pick up where they go in a 24-hour period. And he's discovered that some of these animals that are causing such problem on the farms leave the park about 7 o'clock at night, go in a long way into the agricultural areas, eat as much sugar cane and banana and maize as they can stuff into their mouths, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, scurry home into the park. Innocent as can be. But unfortunately, we now have records that these animals are smart enough to know when it's reasonably safe and when it's not. So this is creating bad blood now with the people. Not only is it a case with elephants, but it's a case with carnivores. And carnivores have found the ease with which you can kill a steer or some sheep that is penned up at night, and it's considerably more easy and less energetic than chasing after a zebra or a wildebeest, and much safer. So if you can slip in and grab a cow and slip out again, as a predator, you're fine, but of course the people no longer are happy. And I say no longer because in East Africa, at any rate, nomads used to consider their flocks as wealth, but wealth that you really didn't spend. But today, with the cost of university education for children, the cost of antibiotics, the cost of getting a truck, and all of these other things, people actually want cash. And when a steer goes, you actually you can put a cash value on it. In a country where it's relatively difficult to get money out of government for anything, these people are suffering a net loss, and so they take the law into their own hands, and we've had a tremendous crisis on carnivores in Kenya and Tanzania recently, where they have poisoned carrion using a poison that was being exported from the United States to Kenya called furidin. And this is an odorless, tasteless poison that kills anything that eats it within a period of 30 minutes. And we believe, on the information we're getting, that the lion population of Kenya has been reduced from around 20,000 to less than 2,000 in the last 6 years. We've finally got the poison banned, but there are ways in which I think it can come back in, and it's just the farmers responding to it. So this is, again, you can mount an international campaign, you can raise a ruckus, you can stop a poison coming in, you can get control. So theoretically, these are all problems we can deal with, and that's fine. But then what about climate change? This seems to be something we can't deal with, whether it's for humans or others. And I think the onset of climate change that we are now registering is a very, very serious concern indeed. And let me talk briefly about my concerns. I have been struck in the last couple of years by finding some of the leaders in conservation talking about if temperatures rise and if the climate changes. And I've had to say on a number of occasions in very esteemed company that I do not understand how people of that stature can use the word if on climate change. And I think it's critical that all of us eliminate that if concept on climate change from any usage by anybody. Climate is changing. We can argue whether it's caused by carbon dioxide burning of fossil fuels, or whether it's caused by hotspots, or whether it's caused by solar flare. We can argue for days on all of this, but there's no question that the climate is changing, and in certain parts of the world, the effect of that climate change is going to be quite remarkable in terms of survival for humans as well as many species. And I see very little prospect that we can do anything about it in terms of maintaining the status quo over the next 30 to 50 years. I say that being fully aware of what a dramatic statement that is, but I would believe that many of the savanna parks are likely to be bereft of many of the larger mammals and bird species that today characterize the inventories of those areas. And I say so because although some areas will probably be maintained because the rainfall will increase, much of Central and Eastern Africa, the rainfall is likely to decrease whilst the human population increases. And I think the shortage or total absence of water and rainfall is a very realistic prospect in the very near future. The question then arises, is there something that we can do? And I have no basis of predicting that the changes that we are seeing, the increase in sea level, the increase in temperature. I mean, I was in the Antarctic earlier this year, and we were told by scientists at one of the research stations that over the last decade, the temperature range in summer has increased by just over 2 degrees Celsius in 10 years. We were shown glaciers that over the last 10 or 11 years have receded by over 350 meters in 10 years, whereas they used to recede 15, 20 years ago about a meter a year. So there are some remarkable things happening in the Antarctic, in the North Pole, and Greenland and those places, and it's also happening on high mountain ranges. And Kilimanjaro, which many of you have not seen in reality, have seen in pictures. People have taken ice cores, looked at the dating of the ice, permanent ice, the glaciers, and most of the tropical African ice sheets on Mount Kenya, the Ruwenzori and Kilimanjaro date at the oldest, the lowest levels turn out to be between 12 and 13,000 years. All of those mountains will lose all the permanent ice and all the glaciers within the next decade. And this is the first time this has happened in 12 or 13,000 years. Now, I think if it only happened in Africa, you say, well, those Africans are running things badly, as usual. But if you go to the Antarctic, you go along the Andes, you go up to the North American Rockies and the Cascades, you come down to the Alps, the Himalayas, all of these, we're seeing the same thing. So something is going on that is well advanced and very serious. We do not yet know much about the impact this will have on ocean currents and monsoon winds and trade winds, but we do know that in the past, climate change has been sufficiently dramatic as to have moments where, although one may be hesitant to use the term mass extinction in terms of the end of the Cretaceous when the last dinosaurs went, you would certainly use it as a moment as great as the moment at the end of the Ice Age when much of the megafauna of North America and Europe and Australia went away. The woolly rhinoceros, the mastodons, the mammoths, the giant ground sloth and others when they disappeared relatively recently, this side of 13,000 years. So I think it's an order of magnitude, perhaps not like the end of the Cretaceous, but certainly approaching, probably within the lifetime of people in this room, what we saw at the end of the last Ice Age, some 10, 12, 13,000 years ago. So there is concern. Is this something that we should simply do nothing about? Obviously, governments, government agencies, and largely taxpayers who are driving this through representative voting and elections are concerned about the fact that there are close to 7.5 billion people in the world. We're going to get to 11 or 12 billion before we hopefully can stabilize and start reducing. Should we really give the slightest thought to whether we lose the megafauna of Africa and the megafauna of South America and the megafauna of Southeast Asia while we have this human problem? And my feeling is that whilst humans are important, and I suppose it's a selfish position to take, I don't think we can afford to be silent on the fate of other species. And I think there is a selfish responsibility for thinking if we can do anything about what is happening. I think if we do nothing, I think climate change in many parts of Africa will see the extinction of a number of important species. Obviously, in some parts of Africa, as we're seeing in other parts of the world, there will be some areas that favor more rainfall, and in those cases, perhaps some of those species will have a better chance of survival. But it wasn't many thousands of years ago that large parts of the Sahara were savanna with giraffe and water-drinking animals. It was certainly since the last ice age that they were there. Rock paintings show that these animals were prolific in many of those areas. There are clear examples in East Africa today where today there is desert, and relatively recently they were forested. We are finding now a distribution of certain primates, like the mangabe, which is a forest-dwelling baboon, quite a rare animal, turning up several hundred kilometers to the east of any known forest, and they show no evidence of having speciated or changed in any way in the genetic. It must be quite a recent movement across there, together with insects and frogs and other things. So how quickly did that happen? And I think we all like to think about this as a very gradual, slow thing. And I think this, if you like, in this year of celebrating the 200th year of Darwin and the publication of his book 150 years ago, perhaps we've been fooled into thinking that's what he meant by his gradual drift from this to that or the other. And I don't think that's quite the way it should be read, but I think the popular media tend to present it that way, that there's change, but it's not going to affect us, and it probably won't affect our grandchildren even, and they'll take care of it at a subsequent time. It's like politicians. I remember talking to the mayors of California, a whole group, about 15 of them, including San Francisco and Oakland, about whether they weren't negligent in opening up their municipalities to lawsuit by allowing people to develop land that was less than a meter above the high water mark. And I said, if these areas go underwater in the next 30 years, which they almost certainly will, don't you feel your municipality could be sued for having zoned land for development, knowing full well from the evidence that is already available that you were selling under false pretenses and this water will go under? Maybe I'm guilty myself because my wife and I own some property in Kenya that is only a meter above sea level, and I've been working double time to sell it. Not because I don't like the land, because I'm quite sure it's not a good gift to give my grandchildren. So these are some of the issues that I think are real. It's not an if, and we don't know whether it's going to happen. And what the mayor said, well, that's another person's problem. It's certainly not within my time frame of 2 elections. And whether they were 4 and 4 or 3 and 3, they all said, that's another time, and we're not responsible for that. That'll be taken care of by our successors. Well, are we sure? And looking at the paleontological record, there is a real possibility of what climate scientists and others are saying is that you may get to a certain point and the whole thing suddenly accelerates. They call it a tipping point, where what appears to be a gradual increase in temperature suddenly goes much more rapidly. What appears to be a very slow increase in sea levels suddenly takes on a speed of its own that gives you very little time to do much about moving several billions of people to high ground. And these are issues that I think we should consider, and I think they're issues that we should consider in terms of nature, wildlife, biodiversity, ecology, or our sense that these are important to the future. What can we do? Well, we obviously, at the moment, have no idea other than the precautionary measures that are being taken to reduce dependency on hydrocarbons and some of the other measures that are being discussed, but that probably is not going to help the existing network of protected areas for biodiversity. So what is it that we can do? There's been a lot of discussion in the past about the merits of ex situ as opposed to in situ conservation. And the idea is you uplift rhino from East Africa and you dump them in Arizona or you take them to Australia. And that's really not because of climate change. That's because the supposition is that Australians and Arizonans may be better after looking after the rhino than Africans. Not true, necessarily. And the last time that was tried with an airlift or ship trip to Australia, I think out of 13 rhino that left Kenya, I think only 6 got to the far shores, and of the 6, I think only 2 are currently alive because they couldn't take to that habitat. So that's one form of ex situ conservation that I don't think holds much hope. Should we be developing a far better gene bank? Should we be looking at preserving tissue? Should we be looking at the sort of requirements for, at some point in time when research has got to the point where you can rebuild something that is now extinct, and they're trying to do it with this wretched baby mammoth that was found somewhere, and they're saying that they're going to make us a new mammoth that will tell us what the mammoth really looked like. Maybe. It's a curiosity at this stage whether they can do it, but I have no doubt that it may be possible at some point in the future, particularly with stem cells and some of the other things that they're doing, to actually be able to restore some biodiversity that we've lost. But you're not going to restore it unless you have something to restore it from. And I think there needs to be a lot of thought given to whether that, in the medium term, isn't a strategy that needs a lot more discussion and consideration. I don't know. But what I also don't know, and which I think is important, particularly in a lecture given in the Royal Society, is do we actually know enough to make any decisions at all? And I think there is a real problem that conservationists and biologists are not looking at this middle section. We don't know what supports many of the species that we now believe are threatened. We don't know what the food chain is, and we don't know at which point you snip the chain and cause species above and below to disappear. And there seems to be a great need for a lot more scientific investigation into the possibilities of interrupting the ecology in place X or place Y, and what the consequences would be, and prioritize some of the urgent measures that are taken. I recognize that if you're dealing in competition with the needs of several extra billions of people that are on their way, and the needs of preserving what appear to be iconic but relatively insignificant species, I know who's going to lose. The question is, it's not just the elephant and the rhinoceros and the orangutan that we're losing. We're also losing a lot of the habitat. And within that habitat, there may be all sorts of solutions to solving problems that may come along. And in particular, we need to be cognizant of the fact that through agriculture and monoculture, we've greatly reduced the genetic integrity of certain species to a point where they're very vulnerable to new diseases that may come up, and we don't have the wild species to go back to look again. And I think rice and wheat and barley and corn would be examples in point. So I'm really urging for the issue to be taken a lot more seriously than we have. I think we need to get some international efforts made to not say if the temperature rises by another 2 degrees, then this area is going to be threatened. It will. I think we can say that with some confidence in many parts of the world. We don't need to say if the rainfall drops to 0, in some places it's going to, and we know this. I think we are probably, and I hate to say this, but I think in some of these major savanna national parks in Africa, we may be too late to sustain them as we have known them. I think it would be not too late to work towards maintaining the real estate, to maintaining the system with whatever can be kept survival. But I think we have probably left some of this discussion too far, and the competition between people and animals under the same pressure of climate change, I think is going to favor people, and it probably should, although I'm not absolutely certain I think that, but I think it probably should. And if it does, I think we either lose it or we need to think fast as to how we can keep some of it. And I don't think we can do it in any way with the traditional approaches that have so preoccupied us for the last 120 years around the world. This, I think, is the challenge. This is what I wanted to address. I don't have the answers. I don't think many my colleagues are talking about this problem, and I think it's probably the single greatest problem that we face from a conservation point of view, and it's assuredly the single greatest problem we face as Homo sapiens in terms of our own lifestyle and the way we occupy this planet. So I think with those remarks, I will probably now call for some questions for 10, 15 minutes, and then get you out of here on time, because I think that's the tradition at the Society. Thank you. Could I just say the question and answer period will be part of the podcast, and so if you have a question, you need to have the mic so that it can be recorded, and I will respond to those who talk to me through the microphone. But we
have two microphones, one there. Where's the other one?
Around the corner here.
Great. So, Ray, would you like to put your hands up first to indicate that you need a microphone? Here we are. Whichever way. And we'll try to remember you subsequently. And then the next one we'll take over this side, if you'd like to deliver a microphone to that gentleman. So it's you, sir, first at the back, is it? Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Leakey, it was a fascinating speech, and at the end you tantalizingly said that you didn't have the solutions, but could you sketch out some alternative, some possibilities? You said that ex situ probably wouldn't work, wholly, that gene banks wouldn't work. What possibilities could you see?
I'm not sure that they will even work, but I think they're avenues we have not explored, and I think we haven't explored some of these avenues because, frankly, most people didn't think we needed to, because there was a certain sense of, well, those places are safe. We put all our hopes into protected areas, and our struggle has been to maintain the protection, which we haven't done very well, but in theory, you can do that. But I don't think anyone has really addressed the problem that with the best protection in the world, what you can't protect against is now what's upon us. And so I think there needs to be a lot of discussion, and one of the purposes of this talk, and I give this sort of talk in a number of places, is to try to get people to actually take it seriously. And when men and women take things seriously, they actually often surprise us with suggestions that come up. And I think this is a very good place to promote thinking, because it's real.
Was there a question here?
Thank you. Governments around the world now recognise the fact that we have got to achieve a very dramatic reduction in our burning of fossil fuels, far greater than that even contemplated by the UK government, which likes to believe that it's in the vanguard of progress on this score, far greater indeed. From a practical point of view, it is inevitable that this will lead to the introduction of per capita carbon rationing across the population of the world, on moral grounds, on practical grounds, on realistic grounds of this being the only way, something only governments can do. The implication of this, with this vast reduction, is that we will all be having to, whether we like it or not, having to live on a very, very small ration each year. That calls into question then the whole function of what you referred to as or didn't refer to it in these terms, but the international tourist element of people flying to Africa to observe these animal species in these parks. That option will no longer be open even to very wealthy people. That is a realistic interpretation of the degree of reduction that we must achieve. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I would agree that tourism as or wildlife or nature tourism, or what they now call ecotourism, which is an oxymoron in my judgment, is clearly not the way for a nation to plan its economic development. And whether or not it's because we're severely carbon rationed, or whether because of terrorism, or whether it's because that this something like this new flu that seems to have emerged is much more serious and others come, I think international travel and the dependency on international travel for raising money for things like conservation or government budgets is pretty well a thing of the past, and I don't think it would sway the argument one way or the other. The worry that I would express, which is not a question that you pose, but implicit in your question, is whilst everybody should be rationed in terms of their carbon allowance, 2/3 of the population hasn't that allowance. And this is a real issue, because if you were to ration the carbon allowance of 90% of the people living in my country, they would not be able to cook a meal, because the only thing they have to cook is wood that they forage for, or charcoal that they buy very cheaply from people who've made it. And it may be something that very few people are aware of, but I live just outside the city of Nairobi. It's an hour and 20 minutes away. There's not too much traffic. And every morning when I drive into work, I drive along a dirt road for about 5 kilometers, usually at the time the kids are walking to school, because they walk 5-8 kilometers to get to school. And every time, every morning, every child is carrying a twig, a piece of wood of some size that he or she has scavenged. And visitors who stayed with him say, why are all these kids going to walk along the road carrying little sticks? I said, well, how would they cook their lunch if they didn't? Now, how you ration that majority of our species is going to be a much more challenging issue. But I think you are right. Governments are going to have to step in. And I believe that one of the latest pieces of information, which is interesting to think how politicians are going to deal with it, is that while carbon dioxide is a serious problem, and that's, I think, where much of the developed nations will have to look to cut and respond to government, an awful lot of the ice melt may now be seen to be, in part, caused by soot, small particles of soot that settle on the ice floes and ice sheets and snowfield. So the snow is no longer radiating as effectively as it was, and you are actually warming from the top simply because of this soot. Much of that is probably being contributed by Africa and Asia, and how do we deal with that? So I think there's some extraordinary challenges this century, and I would have to say, being not totally facetious, but I'm awfully glad that I've reached an age where I don't have to worry too much about them, but I'm also awfully sad because it will be fascinating.
There's a question here. Gentleman had his just here.
Sorry. Do you think that if everybody took a vegan diet, this would surely resolve lots of the conservation problems, in particular for wildlife?
Well, I think the vegan diet would, first of all, dare I say it, because you may well be a vegan, but I'm also at this stage where I'm no longer politically correct. I think a vegan diet is totally unnatural for any primate other than possibly a gorilla or colobus monkey. A full ingestion of good protein is a long-standing tradition amongst most primates, particularly our ancestors and most of ourselves. I don't see how you could turn the population into vegans, given the difficulties of turning even small parts of the population into vegans in most societies that I know. It's a way, and it's a personal choice. Is it a solution that you could impose or sell? I would have to say, I don't think so. And I think we've got to get to a much more serious level of discussion about the underlying fundamental issues of what are we going to do over the next 30 years. It would take more than that to make me a vegan, I promise you. But let me stop there.
I see a hand up at the back. So, yes, that gentleman. And then we'll take one from this side after that. So
yes.
Yes, sir.
Could I also thank you for, I think, giving a very clear picture of the risk we're facing when we look at protected areas. Hopefully, the more the climate modelling community can work with biodiversity and conservation communities, the better we'll have the clarity. But we know there are scenarios with climate emissions where we're in the realms of whether humans will have a survivable future, and we won't be too worried about the other elements of biodiversity. But assuming we do get our act together sufficiently to avoid the worst scenarios, then one would like to think there is a fighting chance, and part of that solution will be these actual protected areas and how they're managed, assisted migration, etc. It might, if we can avoid the worst scenarios, these protected areas, perhaps thinking of the Savo systems, big systems, which, if anything, has some degree of potential robustness to cope with those shifting dynamics. It's still a bit of a long shot, but it's all we got. We only have the one planet, of course. And the more people are aware that there is no assured protection with these big systems, but if you're talking about the Barrier Reef, we know that there was a workshop here with the actual Royal Society which looked at how imperiled the actual Amazon was. If these systems go down, then we're really in a terrible future where we're looking at our own survival, viability, of course. But if we can get it together to avoid the worst, how we look at these parks, how we manage these natural systems, there's a real challenge there. But the work that's been done to date to keep them going, hopefully, can be part of that solution. And it would be nice to know how you can see that message getting out and how we can move forward.
Well, it was a long question, but let me just refer to part of that. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should simply pack up our business and say, well, we can't do anything about it, so let's do something else. However, I think we have to be fairly clear that it's a much bigger challenge than many conservationists and governments have taken on board yet. And you talk about the Savo, which is one of the largest national parks in East Africa. It's about the size of Serengeti. It's largely fed by two rivers, the Savo River and the Galana River, which comes off the highlands of Kenya. The likelihood of both of those rivers drying up in the next decade is very high. Partly because there's less rainfall in the catchment area, partly because there's less retention of water in the catchment area because of deforestation, and partly because a lot of the water is being taken off for irrigation before it gets into the park. Now, if those two rivers dry up, there will be at least 9 months a year with no water. Now, I can't see, if there's no water, how you're going to retain that ecosystem in terms of some of the species that make it such a magnificent place. Now, I think we should be looking at this, but I think the point that I tried to make, and I'll repeat it here, is it is only when we speak with a degree of certainty that we really are in a crisis that you're likely to get anyone really thinking of solutions. But if you think, if the climate changes, many of your practitioners and politicians are going to say, well, tell us when it's no longer if, and we'll then start taking it seriously. And I think we've passed that point a number of years ago. And the point I'm making, as I said right at the beginning, let's eliminate if climate changes, if the temperature goes up, if places dry out. They're going to do all of that in different places in different ways, and we need to know the impact of that anyway, irrespective of maintaining the good fight to try and stop other causes of total extinction. But I mean, I'll just very quickly tell you, I was with a film producer flying back from New York to Washington, or Washington to New York the other day, and I was talking about this very issue. And she said, she kept arguing with me, you know, we can't make a film about that because that's been talked about, can't make a film about that. And I said, well, let me tell you the truth. I don't think there's a chance in hell that we're going to save anything. And frankly, I was just trying to help you with making a program. And if you're not interested, I actually don't think there's a film anywhere because I don't think there's anything to do. He said, now you're talking. Can we talk about that film? For the first time, I had her attention. And I think we need to be much more realistic about what's upon us.
Richard, are you prepared to take another couple of questions?
Of course
it's
I
really
am.
Fascinating.
I'm here at your pleasure, and you're the boss.
Certainly. We'll take one from this side, and then we'll come to you.
Yes,
please.
hello. I'm curious as to what you think can be done about the human population of the planet, and if you have any insight on discussions that are being held, perhaps among circles that you frequent. Some research I've done recently is indicative that this is really the big issue, even though it is extremely politically incorrect to discuss.
Well, I think you're right. The human population it's not the cause in one sense, but it's the problem. And we're going to be faced with not quite a doubling, but possibly a doubling before we turn this back. But It's politically incorrect, but I think we need to talk about it. And I don't think there's any question about that. But I think we need to talk about it not with conservationists, but we need to talk about it with a number of people who I don't necessarily need to mention their professions. But there's been an active onslaught against any effort or measure that might limit growth to the human population. And you know where I'm coming from. I could say that I think some of the religious dogma and faith-driven policies have been totally unacceptable in terms of what it's doing to this planet. We have to fight back.
Thank you, Richard. There was a gentleman. Well, first you, right, and then you.
Thank you. My question sort of relates to one of the earlier ones. When you were talking about the water crisis in East Africa, it doesn't just put pressure on the parks, of course, but all those farms that you said surround those areas, how close are they to being really on the brink of a major disaster in farming and starvation and so on?
Well, how close are they to facing a disaster? In Kenya, which has been self-sufficient in food for the last 30 years, we currently, as of last week, the predictions were that there are over 10 million in a 34 million population who are short of food and can expect starvation over the next 6 weeks, because where there has been rain, it's limited, and the crops have to then grow and be harvested. So we are facing a third of our population already facing famine that have never had to face it before. Now, this can be extended across the southern Sahel, and you see it in parts of Asia and other parts of the world. It is a mammoth crisis that we're facing. But is it just going to be that bad, or is it going to get much worse? And you know, if you raise the sea level, or the sea level raises to the extent that we believe it will, it is rising. But if that ice melts as rapidly as people are saying it might, you're going to have Bangladesh underwater. You're going to have many parts of the world, the seaboards and the littoral along the coastline, where many people live, gone. And you're going to have billions of people looking for new homes. And many of these people will not necessarily fit the profile of who you want as immigrants in your own countries. We have some real issues to deal with. But I think that, and people say, why do you keep talking about animals? I do so because very few people are talking about animals, and they need a voice too.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
2 years ago, James Lovelock gave a talk in this very room at which he said that by the end of the century, billions of human people would die because of pressure of population and climate change. Do you think he was exaggerating?
Do I think he was exaggerating by saying at the end of this century, the 21st century, billions of people will face certain death because of climate change and starvation? I think he's right on the mark. I'm not so sure that at the end of the century. It could well happen significantly before that.
Is there one final burning question? Here's a gentleman. Can you bring me?
I agree with everything you say, but 2 points. One, does it have to get worse before it gets better? And also, if we're trying to save the planet, who are we trying to save the planet for?
Does it have to get worse before it gets better? That's putting a turn on it that I don't like. I think I would say it doesn't have to, but it's going to get worse. And it may get better. But I don't think you can connect the two, because I don't think humans can be relied upon necessarily to respond to that sort of stimulus, particularly when you're dealing with representative government. And although it's a significant education effort in terms of what information is available to people, are we teaching people to get at that information and respond to that information? And I think this IT, Google, instant access to become an expert is not helping a lot of people think, because they get easy answers and move on to somewhere else. And the second part of your question was, who are we trying to save the planet for? Well, I suppose, in a funny way, our successors. I certainly would like my children and grandchildren to have the pleasure and fun and richness that I've had. Is it important in the cosmic scale of things? Certainly not. Would it be a tragedy if humans became extinct together with most other megafauna? Absolutely not. I see no difficulty about that. I just would prefer to have got off before that happens. But that's a very selfish position. But, you know, people say to me, does it matter if there are no more elephants? Of course it doesn't matter. But if we lose the elephants because we've been so negligent about thinking about what we need to do, the chances are we're going to lose other things that may not be so iconic, but for which we really need a little more care, because they may be the solution to some of our self-made problems in terms of disease and things of this kind. So let's say, no, in the scheme of things, we will become extinct. In the scheme of things, it's irrelevant. But in the reality, you know, I've had a great day, I'm going to have a great evening, and I'm going to have another great day tomorrow, and I do not wish to see anyone limit my choices of having fun, and I would like my own children and grandchildren to enjoy that experience. Their grandchildren, listen, I can sign along the dotted line that it doesn't matter, but for my people, I want to do something. Thank you. Shall I go down? Okay. Oh, okay, go ahead. All right. Thank you.
It remains for me, ladies and gentlemen, to offer a vote of thanks to Richard for an absolutely tremendous, and as evidenced by the questions, a tremendous and hugely stimulating lecture on a vitally important subject. Richard exposes the need for awareness and awareness of the threats in the key corridors of power. One of his personal mottos is that if you want something done by me, that's Richard, suggest that it can't be done. In view of all his contacts, in view of the fact that he speaks with enormous authority upon these absolutely critical issues, I think one message we should send to Richard is, you're not too old. For God's sake, keep up the good work. Campaign for your grandchildren if you don't wish to campaign for yourself. On behalf of all of us, thank you very much for a stimulating lecture, and keep up the good work. Thank you, Richard.